In the summer of 1944, the Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, an immense line of fire and retreat. The Soviet Union had launched Operation Bagration on June 22nd, a massive offensive that obliterated Germany's Army Group Center and advanced up to 600 kilometers westward in just over a month. Entire German corps ceased to exist. Over 400,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. As the Wehrmacht reeled from this catastrophe, the Red Army's momentum drove toward the Baltic states, an area that would soon become the next crucial theater of the war. The Baltic region, encompassing Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, held immense strategic importance for both sides. For Germany, it provided a defensive shield for East Prussia and the northern flank of Army Group North. The ports of Riga, Liepaja, and Tallinn were vital for supply and evacuation, while the rail junctions at Shyaulyai and Jelgava connected German forces to the rear. For the Soviet Union, seizing the Baltics meant cutting off Army Group North entirely and securing the approaches to East Prussia and the Baltic coastline. Stalin's objective was to isolate and destroy the German northern armies before they could regroup with forces retreating from Belarus and Poland. The Lithuanian city of Šiauliai, known in German as Šiauliai, became a focal point of this clash. Located about 120 kilometers from the Latvian border, Šiauliai sat at the crossroads of major north-south and east-west communication lines. Whoever controlled the city controlled the entire logistical backbone of Northern Army Group North. The Red Army's First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagration was tasked with capturing it as part of the continuation of Operation Bagration. Its strength exceeded 600,000 men, including the 4th Shock Army, 43rd Army, 51st Army, and the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, supported by approximately 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 2,000 aircraft from the 3rd Air Army. Facing them stood remnants of the German 3rd Panzer Army and the newly arrived elements of the 4th Panzer Army. The German forces, numbering around 200,000 men with roughly 400 tanks and assault guns, were commanded by Colonel General Georg Hans Reinhardt. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and retreating through devastated terrain. Nevertheless, Hitler demanded that Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, hold its positions at all costs. The order effectively transformed the Baltic region into a defensive trap, forcing German troops to fight encirclements rather than retreat to shorter defensive lines. The political backdrop of the operation was equally complex. The Soviet government sought to reassert control over territories lost in 1941, presenting the campaign as a liberation of the Baltic peoples. Yet for many locals, the arrival of Soviet forces meant the return of an oppressive regime that had already deported thousands during the first occupation of 1940-41. In Lithuania and Latvia, partisan groups, still hostile to both occupiers, operated in the forests, sabotaging both German and Soviet supply lines. This layered conflict turned the Baltics into one of the most politically charged regions of the Eastern Front. By mid-July 1944, reconnaissance reports indicated that German defenses around Shyaulyai were fragmenting. The Red Army's advance toward the Baltic Sea threatened to cut off the entire Army Group North from the rest of the Wehrmacht, forming what Soviet planners called the Baltic Cauldron. German commanders, aware of this danger, proposed a controlled withdrawal to the Venta River line and later to the Daugava. Hitler, however, refused, insisting on a counterattack to restore the situation. This decision would set the stage for one of the last large-scale armored operations of the Wehrmacht in the East, the Panzer Counterstrike that would become known as the Battle of Shyaulyai. In the weeks before the battle, both sides raced to regroup. The Soviets extended their supply lines over hundreds of kilometers of ruined railways, bridges, and mined roads. Ammunition and fuel shortages began to slow their advance. Meanwhile, German engineers worked feverishly to rebuild shattered crossings and prepare defensive belts with anti-tank ditches, minefields, and fortified strongpoints. The Luftwaffe's air presence was minimal, with only about 250 operational aircraft across the entire sector, compared to nearly 10 times that number on the Soviet side. Yet, despite this disparity, German morale among armored units, particularly the elite Grossdeutschland Division and elements of the 4th and 5th Panzer Divisions, remained surprisingly resilient. The stage was thus set by late July 1944. The Red Army was preparing to drive toward the Baltic coast and close the ring around Army Group North, while the Wehrmacht, desperate to prevent its isolation, gathered its remaining armored forces for a decisive strike. The battlefield around Shyaulyai, a landscape of forests, rivers, and small towns, would soon witness one of the most violent clashes of maneuver warfare in the final year of the Eastern Front. It was a confrontation shaped by strategic necessity, political calculation, and the last reserves of a collapsing army that still refused to retreat. By late July 1944, the Soviet First Baltic Front began its coordinated advance toward Shyauliai. The offensive opened on July 27th, supported by concentrated artillery barrages and the airstrikes of the Third Air Army. Soviet reconnaissance units reported that German lines were disorganized but still capable of local resistance. Bagramian ordered the 43rd and 51st Armies to push westward, while the 2nd Guards Tank Corps spearheaded the drive on the city itself. Within the first 48 hours, Soviet forces advanced more than 20 kilometers, overrunning several German defensive positions near Joniskis and Tituvanai. The front line fractured, and the Red Army sought to exploit the gaps before the Germans could mount a coordinated response. On the German side, the situation was chaotic. The retreating formations of the 3rd Panzer Army were scattered along the Lithuanian countryside, struggling to reorganize after the collapse of Army Group Center. Field Marshal Schörner, recently placed in command of Army Group North, attempted to impose strict discipline, threatening any commander who withdrew without orders. Reinforcements were rushed from East Prussia and northern Poland, including the 4th Panzer Division, the 5th Panzer Division, and the elite Grossdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division, all under the temporary operational control of General Dietrich von Saucken. Together, these units formed the core of a counterattack force intended to halt the Soviet breakthrough at Šiauliai. The initial Soviet assault achieved rapid tactical success. On July 29th, the 2nd Guards Tank Corps entered the outskirts of Šiauliai, engaging elements of the German 551st Grenadier Division in urban combat. The city, already devastated by previous bombings, became a maze of burning buildings and barricades. Street fighting erupted as Soviet infantry cleared house after house under cover of tank fire. The Germans, short of ammunition, but determined to delay the attackers, fought stubbornly from cellars and fortified basements. By July 31st, the Red Army had taken full control of the city, raising the Soviet flag over the ruins of its central square. Yet, even as the Soviets celebrated the capture of Šiauliai, reports arrived that large German armored columns were massing southwest of the city. Reconnaissance flights identified approximately 150 tanks and assault guns concentrating near Tilsit and Kelmé. These formations, part of the newly organized Escalating Panzer Corps, were preparing for a sudden counterstrike. Hitler had personally approved the operation, believing it could restore the connection between army groups north and center by cutting through the overextended Soviet spearheads. The order demanded an immediate attack toward the northeast, aiming to retake Šiauliai and reach the coast near Jelgava. Soviet headquarters underestimated the scale of the German preparations. Intelligence summaries from the First Baltic Front concluded that German forces were merely conducting limited local counterattacks. As a result, many Soviet armored formations were deployed deep within the city and its surrounding villages without establishing strong defensive lines to the west. Supply convoys, moving along narrow dirt roads, were caught in traffic jams as reinforcements tried to move forward. Bagramian ordered a pause to regroup and resupply, unaware that the German Panzer Corps was already moving into position. The German counteroffensive began on August 2, 1944. At dawn, more than 300 artillery pieces opened fire on Soviet positions west of Šiauliai, followed by armored spearheads led by the Grossdeutschland Division. The terrain favored the attackers. Rolling fields and low hills allowed tanks to maneuver rapidly and flank Soviet positions. In the first hours, the Germans achieved deep penetrations, destroying several Soviet forward detachments and capturing numerous supply trucks. The Red Army's 2nd Guards Tank Corps, taken by surprise, was forced into defensive combat, losing dozens of T-34s in the initial clashes. Fighting intensified along the Venta River, where Soviet engineers tried to blow bridges to slow the advance. The Germans, supported by assault guns and Panzer IIs, managed to cross under heavy fire, forcing Soviet infantry to retreat toward the northern outskirts of the city. The Luftwaffe, though limited in numbers, provided close air support with Ju-87 dive bombers and FW-190 ground attack aircraft, targeting Soviet artillery concentrations. By the evening of August 2nd, German troops had advanced nearly 20 kilometers, threatening to encircle several Soviet units positioned too far west. Soviet commanders reacted quickly. Bagramyan ordered the 4th Shock Army to pivot south and strike the flanks of the German thrust, while the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps was brought in from reserve. Fierce engagements broke out near Kelmé and Shyaulyai, where Soviet tank brigades counterattacked against the advancing German spearheads. Both sides suffered heavy losses. The Germans lost around 50 tanks on the first day, while Soviet losses were estimated at over 70. Despite the high cost, the Germans succeeded in temporarily stabilizing their northern front and created a salient that reached within striking distance of the Shyaulyai-Jelgava Railway. By August 3rd, the battlefield extended over a 60-kilometer front, with constant movement of units and shifting lines. The Soviet command understood that the battle had entered a critical phase. While they still held Shyauliai itself, their western approaches were under severe pressure. The panzer divisions continued their offensive, attempting to cut through the Soviet supply routes and restore contact with Army Group North. The Battle of Shyauliai was no longer just a local engagement. It had become a struggle for control of the entire Baltic corridor. The German counteroffensive that erupted on August 2nd rapidly expanded into one of the largest armored engagements in the northern sector of the Eastern Front during 1944. The Exim-Waningen Panzer Corps, composed primarily of the Grossdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division, the 4th and 5th Panzer Divisions, and supported by the 7th Panzer Division brought in from Poland, struck with unusual precision and coordination. Each division fielded between 80 and 100 operational tanks and assault guns, including Panther and Panzer IV models, along with Stu-G3 assault guns and Nashorn tank destroyers. Their objective was ambitious: to cut the Soviet corridor between Shyauliai and Jelgava, reach the coast of the Gulf of Riga, and re-establish direct contact with the trapped formations of Army Group North. The initial momentum favored the Germans. Using combined arms tactics honed through years of experience, they exploited weaknesses in the Soviet defensive line. Soviet units had extended themselves too far west, with their armored corps stretched thin across poor road networks that could not handle heavy supply traffic. The Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Corps and elements of the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps found themselves fighting in isolation, often without artillery or air support due to the rapid redeployment of frontline resources. Radio communications were frequently disrupted by jamming or destroyed infrastructure, forcing local commanders to rely on couriers and field telephones. The resulting confusion allowed German armored spearheads to advance up to 30 kilometers in some sectors by August 4th. At Kelmé, the Grossdeutschland Division executed a rapid encirclement maneuver, trapping elements of the Soviet 51st Army. The German Panther battalions, supported by self-propelled artillery, delivered devastating firepower at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Dozens of Soviet T-34s were set ablaze in open fields, while infantry units were forced to withdraw through wooded terrain under constant artillery shelling. Reports from the Soviet First Baltic Front recorded that entire battalions were wiped out or forced to abandon vehicles due to fuel shortages. The Soviet supply chain had overextended itself to maintain the offensive momentum after Operation Bagration, and now the logistical fatigue began to show its effects. Despite these German successes, the situation was far from stable. The Red Army's numerical superiority, both in manpower and material, allowed it to absorb local losses and reform defensive positions quickly. General Bagramian's headquarters ordered immediate countermeasures. The 5th Guards Tank Army, which had been operating further south near Kaunas, was redirected toward the Shyaulyai sector. It consisted of over 700 tanks and self-propelled guns, including IS-2 heavy tanks capable of engaging German armor on equal terms. Within 3 days, elements of this formation began arriving at critical junctions north of the German breakthrough. By August 5th, the battle spread across a front exceeding 120 kilometers, turning central Lithuania into a vast field of maneuver warfare. The Germans launched successive thrusts westward toward the Venta River, but every kilometer gained was paid for with mounting losses. The Soviet Third Air Army intensified operations, flying over 1,000 sorties in a single day. Il-2 Sturmovix, operating in pairs, strafed German convoys and destroyed fuel depots, while Yak-9 fighters harassed columns attempting to regroup. The Luftwaffe, with fewer than 200 available aircraft, could not maintain continuous coverage. Pilots of Schlachtgeschwader 1 and 3 flew multiple sorties daily, but fuel shortages and Soviet anti-aircraft fire forced many to abort missions or operate at dangerously low altitudes. The terrain further complicated German operations. Lithuania's patchwork of forests, marshes, and narrow roads prevented large armored formations from maneuvering freely. Panther tanks frequently bogged down in soft ground, while supply vehicles became easy targets for Soviet artillery. The summer weather, initially favorable, turned against both armies as heavy rains in early August transformed dirt roads into mud tracks. Mechanized columns slowed to a crawl, and tanks often required towing by recovery vehicles simply to remain mobile. Nevertheless, German commanders persisted. Von Sauken, operating from a forward command post near Tytuvenai, urged his divisions to continue pushing toward Jelgava despite growing casualties. By his estimate, a link-up with Army Group North was still possible if the Soviet front collapsed under pressure. Hitler's directives reinforced this view, emphasizing that the Baltic region must not be abandoned under any circumstances. In Berlin, the German High Command still viewed the operation as a potential turning point, a chance to stabilize the Northern Front after the catastrophic defeat in Belarus. Soviet command saw it differently. To them, the Panzer counteroffensive represented a desperate last act of an enemy incapable of sustained warfare. Bagramian's strategy shifted from offense to containment. His armies established successive defensive belts east of the Venta River, each reinforced by anti-tank artillery and minefields. Mobile groups of Su-85 and Su-100 self-propelled guns were deployed to intercept German spearheads. Soviet engineers blew bridges, flooded lowlands, and used scorched earth tactics to deny the Germans any usable infrastructure. Villages such as Tverai, Varniai, and Kurshenai became fortified nodes of resistance, defended by combined units of infantry and tanks working in close coordination. Civilian populations in the battle zone suffered acutely. Many villages were caught in the path of advancing and retreating forces, enduring shelling and forced evacuations. Thousands of Lithuanian civilians fled toward the forests or to the north, fearing reprisals from both sides. German field police rounded up able-bodied men to repair roads and dig anti-tank trenches, while Soviet partisans sabotaged these works at night. The chaos of constant movement turned the region into a zone of humanitarian disaster. By August 7th, the German advance had reached its high-water mark. By August 8th, the Soviet forces had launched coordinated counterattacks across multiple axes. The German front, overextended and exhausted, faced the very danger it had sought to prevent: encirclement. By the end of the first week of August, both sides had suffered staggering material losses, over 500 tanks destroyed or disabled on each side, and tens of thousands of men killed, wounded, or missing. The Battle of Shyaulyai had transformed into a prolonged struggle of attrition. What had begun as a bold counteroffensive was now turning into a battle of survival for the Wehrmacht in the Baltic theater. The second phase of the Battle of Shyauliai unfolded between August 8th and August 15th, 1944, as both sides committed their full reserves to a struggle that determined the fate of the northern sector of the Eastern Front. After the initial German advance lost momentum, the Red Army initiated a methodical counteroffensive designed to seal off the panzer thrust and restore the strategic situation around Shyaulyai. Soviet command had no intention of allowing the Wehrmacht to re-establish contact with Army Group North. To achieve this, Bagramyan coordinated his operations with the Second Baltic Front to the north, ensuring a convergence of Soviet forces that would envelop the German spearheads from multiple directions. By early August 9th, Soviet artillery units had established overwhelming fire superiority. More than 3,000 guns and mortars were concentrated along a front of barely 100 kilometers, with ammunition stocks replenished from depots near Kaunas and Panevėžys. The Red Army initiated a series of rolling barrages, each lasting several hours, targeting German supply convoys, fuel depots, and concentration areas. The Third Air Army conducted over 1,200 sorties in a single day, employing Il-2s for low-altitude attacks on armored columns and PO-2 night bombers to disrupt German rear areas. The Luftwaffe attempted to retaliate, but could muster fewer than 180 operational aircraft, many of them engaged in defensive air patrols over East Prussia. German air units such as JG-54 and SG-3 operated at the limits of endurance, their sorties reduced by lack of aviation fuel and spare parts. On the ground, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army launched a powerful counterstroke from the east, striking the flanks of the Grossdeutschland and 4th Panzer Divisions near Tituvanai. The terrain, dense with forests and small lakes, limited large-scale tank maneuvers, forcing close-range engagements. The battlefields were littered with destroyed vehicles, burned-out supply trucks, and shattered villages. At short distances, Soviet IS-2 tanks used their 122-mm guns to devastating effect, often knocking out German armor with a single hit. The Germans responded with Panther tanks, whose superior optics and frontal armor allowed them to engage at long range, but ammunition shortages and mechanical failures reduced their effectiveness. Reports from German field maintenance units indicated that nearly 30% of all operational tanks were immobilized by breakdowns within the first 5 days of the counteroffensive. Meanwhile, to the south near Reseniai, the Soviet 51st Army advanced through swampy lowlands, cutting the road network that supplied the German XT's 99's Panzer Corps. German logistics, already under strain, began to collapse. Columns of horse-drawn wagons and fuel trucks were repeatedly ambushed by Soviet partisans and attacked from the air. Every kilometer of retreat or advance cost irreplaceable resources. By mid-August, the German command admitted that fuel reserves had fallen to less than 20% of requirements, forcing units to abandon vehicles and rely on captured Soviet supplies whenever possible. Nevertheless, the German armored formations continued to resist with remarkable discipline. The Grossdeutschland Division, reinforced by remnants of the 14th and 21st Infantry Divisions, formed a defensive ring around the salient south of Šiauliai. Infantry battalions dug trenches, fortified farmhouses, and converted destroyed tanks into fixed gun emplacements. Artillery regiments used pre-registered fire to cover all approaches. Soviet attacks were met with coordinated counterfire and counterattacks at company and battalion level, demonstrating the Wehrmacht's enduring tactical skill despite its deteriorating strategic situation. The battle reached its peak intensity on August 12th, when both sides launched simultaneous assaults. The Soviets, intent on closing the corridor once and for all, advanced with more than 400 tanks along the Tverai-Kurshunai axis. The Germans responded with their remaining armored strength, an estimated 250 operational tanks and assault guns, supported by concentrated artillery barrages. The fighting degenerated into a series of chaotic clashes over small villages, river crossings, and forest clearings. Positions changed hands multiple times within hours. The heat, smoke, and dust made communication nearly impossible. Observers later described the region as a continuous inferno stretching for tens of kilometers, where lines of demarcation ceased to exist. On the Soviet side, logistical efficiency began to show results. Railway engineers rebuilt key bridges over the Dubiza and Venta rivers, enabling the uninterrupted delivery of ammunition and fuel. By contrast, German supply routes were collapsing. Intercepted communications revealed growing desperation among German commanders. Requests for reinforcements or fuel went unanswered. By August 13th, von Saucken's corps reported tank fuel stocks sufficient for only one more day of sustained combat operations. Despite this, orders from Hitler's headquarters continued to demand that Shyaulyai be retaken at any cost. The psychological strain on both armies was immense. Soldiers fought continuously without rest or rotation. Temperatures during the Baltic summer rose above 30 degrees C, and water sources were often contaminated. Medical units were overwhelmed. German field hospitals, already short of supplies, resorted to reusing bandages and operating without anesthesia. Soviet casualty evacuation teams faced similar difficulties, moving thousands of wounded over ruined roads under constant shell fire. The human cost of the battle escalated dramatically. As Soviet pressure mounted, the German front began to disintegrate. Between August 14th and 15, the Soviet Second Guards Tank Corps broke through near Šiauliai, encircling portions of the 4th Panzer Division. Attempts to break out were met with concentrated anti-tank fire from Su-100 and Su-85 batteries concealed in forests. By the evening of August 15th, nearly 6,000 German soldiers were surrounded and cut off from their main force. The Red Army destroyed over 100 tanks and captured large quantities of ammunition and fuel. Soviet engineers immediately began using captured German vehicles to reinforce their own supply network. The collapse of the German salient marked the turning point of the Shyauliai counteroffensive. For the first time, it became clear that the Panzer operation had failed to achieve its strategic objective. The Soviet lines remained intact, and Army Group North was still isolated from the main body of the Wehrmacht. Hitler's directive to maintain the Baltic fortress now appeared increasingly unrealistic. German commanders on the ground urged permission to withdraw to the Daugava line to prevent total encirclement. The OKH in Berlin, however, continued to insist that the front be held. The result was a gradual fragmentation of command and growing distrust between local field officers and higher headquarters. By mid-August, the Germans were forced into a fighting retreat under constant Soviet pursuit. The Red Army's artillery and air superiority ensured that every attempt at regrouping was met with overwhelming firepower. Villages that had been captured days earlier were abandoned once again. The once proud divisions that had spearheaded the Panzer Counterstrike were reduced to fragments. Companies instead of battalions, platoons instead of regiments. For the Wehrmacht, the Battle of Shyaulyai was no longer about victory, but about survival. The Soviet advance continued relentlessly. By August 16th, forward units reached the outskirts of Jelgava, effectively cutting the last major road connection between Army Groups North and Center. The German counterattack, initially conceived as a bold operational maneuver, had degenerated into a costly failure. Yet even as Soviet reports celebrated the restoration of the front, they acknowledged the ferocity of German resistance and the scale of destruction left across northern Lithuania. The Battle of Šiauliai was entering its final phase, one that would determine the fate of thousands still trapped within the shrinking German pocket. By August 16, 1944, the Battle of Šiauliai had entered its final destructive phase. What had begun as a German attempt to restore contact with Army Group North had turned into a chaotic retreat under unrelenting Soviet pressure. The counteroffensive that Hitler had once described as the decisive stroke of the Northern Front now lay in ruins. Entire German divisions, once the backbone of the Wehrmacht's armored might, were fragmented into isolated groups fighting desperate rearguard actions. For both sides, the struggle around Šiauliai had transformed into a brutal contest of endurance rather than maneuver. Soviet operational reports for August 17th indicated that the First Baltic Front now held the initiative across the entire sector. The 5th Guards Tank Army and 4th Shock Army advanced in coordination, gradually encircling German formations still holding the corridor between Kurshenai and Tituvanai. The remnants of the Grossdeutschland Division, down to fewer than 40 operational tanks, withdrew through burning villages, while attempting to delay the Red Army's advance long enough to permit an organized evacuation. The 4th and 5th Panzer Divisions, battered by continuous air and artillery strikes, reported combat strengths at barely 30% of their original numbers. German radio traffic was filled with fragmented requests for fuel, ammunition, and medical evacuation that could no longer be met. The Soviets, despite their success, faced their own difficulties. The extended supply lines across ruined terrain slowed the delivery of fuel and shells. Many tank brigades were operating at half strength, and crews had been fighting for weeks with minimal rest. Soviet artillery units consumed over 60,000 shells daily, straining logistical capacity to its limits. Yet the command structure remained intact, and morale was high. Bagramyan emphasized in his daily briefing that the destruction of the German counterattack would not only secure the Baltic region, but also open the way to Riga and the encirclement of Army Group North. His strategy was simple but effective. Relentless pressure across the front combined with localized breakthroughs to destroy isolated German groups before they could regroup. Between August 17 and 19, Soviet armored spearheads tightened the noose around the German salient. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps and 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps converged from the east and north, while the 51st Army advanced from the south. The coordinated assault trapped roughly 20,000 German troops near the town of Tverai. Attempts to break out were met by devastating artillery barrages and concentrated anti-tank fire. Eyewitness accounts from Soviet war correspondents described endless columns of burning German vehicles and shattered villages reduced to rubble. Luftwaffe aircraft tried to provide airdrops of supplies, but Soviet fighters intercepted most transport planes before they reached their targets. Inside the encirclement, conditions deteriorated rapidly. German soldiers were exhausted, their rations long depleted. Water sources were contaminated by shelling, and field hospitals overflowed with wounded. Commanders attempted to destroy equipment that could not be evacuated to prevent its capture. Hundreds of vehicles were set on fire, creating vast plumes of smoke that marked the position of the trapped forces. Von Sauken, still in command of the XDE 2nd Panzer Corps, issued a final order: hold positions until nightfall, then attempt a breakout toward the southwest. On the night of August 19th, scattered German groups tried to break through Soviet lines under the cover of darkness. Most were annihilated by machine gun and mortar fire. Only small detachments succeeded in reaching friendly positions. By August 20th, Soviet reports confirmed the collapse of organized German resistance in the Shyaulyai sector. The Red Army captured over 7,000 prisoners, destroyed or captured nearly 200 tanks, and seized large quantities of weapons, ammunition, and vehicles. The victory secured Soviet control over northern Lithuania and completed the isolation of Army Group North, which was now trapped in what would later be known as the Courland Pocket. The remnants of the German divisions withdrew toward Riga and Tukums, attempting to establish a new defensive line along the Venta River. For the Soviets, the victory carried strategic significance far beyond the immediate battlefield. The First Baltic Front had effectively severed the last land connection between German forces in the Baltics and the rest of the Eastern Front. The result was the creation of a vast, isolated group of approximately 200,000 German soldiers who would remain cut off until the end of the war. The operation also opened the road to the Baltic coast, allowing Soviet naval units to re-enter ports previously controlled by the Kriegsmarine. Yet the cost was enormous. Soviet records indicate that from July 27 to August 20th, the First Baltic Front suffered more than 90,000 casualties, including over 20,000 killed. German losses were even higher, estimated at 110,000 men, including the destruction of more than half of their armored strength in the region. Thousands of Lithuanian civilians perished in the crossfire or were displaced from their homes. Entire towns, Kuršanai, Kelmi, Taituvanai, were reduced to ruins. The region's infrastructure, from bridges to railroads, lay in total devastation. By the end of August, the front stabilized temporarily as Soviet forces paused to regroup and repair equipment. The German retreat continued northward, pursued by relentless Soviet reconnaissance units. What remained of the once formidable German panzer divisions was absorbed into improvised defensive groups. The Battle of Shyaulyai had ended, but its consequences extended far beyond the fields and forests of Lithuania. It marked the destruction of Germany's last coherent armored counteroffensive in the east, the sealing of the Baltic front, and the irreversible decline of the Wehrmacht's capacity to conduct large-scale operations. The Soviet advance would soon reach the Baltic coast itself, transforming the strategic landscape of the war in northern Europe. After the collapse of the German counteroffensive in mid-August 1944, the region around Šiauliai became a landscape of devastation. Both armies, drained by 3 weeks of continuous combat, faced the immediate task of stabilizing their front lines. The Soviet First Baltic Front, though victorious, had extended its forces to the limit. Bagramyan ordered his armies to consolidate their positions, restore logistics, and prepare for the next phase, the drive toward the Baltic Sea and the eventual liberation of Riga. For the Germans, the defeat marked the irreversible fragmentation of the northern front. The remnants of the Escalating Panzer Corps and several infantry divisions withdrew toward the Daugava River, attempting to establish a new defensive line to protect the approaches to Latvia. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the scale of destruction was immense. Across northern Lithuania, hundreds of villages were burned to the ground. Roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles, dead livestock, and unburied bodies. Soviet engineers began clearing mines and repairing rail lines within days of the city's liberation, while medical units treated thousands of wounded soldiers from both sides. The 5th Guards Tank Army alone reported over 18,000 casualties during the Shyauliai operation, including more than 3,000 tank crewmen killed or missing. The Red Army's recovery operations lasted well into September, as units salvaged usable vehicles and buried the dead. German equipment, especially Panthers and Stu-Gs left behind, was recovered and sometimes pressed into Soviet service after repairs. On the German side, the retreat from Lithuania was chaotic. Communications between the surviving divisions and Army Group North had broken down. Supply trains were destroyed by Soviet aircraft, and fuel depots were abandoned or captured. Many German units lacked transportation, forcing soldiers to march long distances under constant air attacks. Civilians fleeing north toward Latvia joined these columns, creating scenes of confusion and panic. Lithuanian towns such as Joniškis and Mažeikiai became temporary refugee centers, overwhelmed by thousands of displaced people. Soviet partisans took advantage of the disarray, cutting telephone lines and ambushing retreating convoys. German rearguards responded with brutal reprisals, executing suspected collaborators and burning villages suspected of aiding Soviet irregulars. Strategically, the defeat at Šiauliai sealed the fate of Army Group North. By late August, the Red Army had advanced to the coast near Tukums, effectively cutting the last land corridor connecting the German forces in the Baltics with Army Group Center. Approximately 200,000 German troops, remnants of the 16th and 18th Armies, were trapped in what became known as the Courland Pocket. Although Hitler insisted they continue to hold the region as a fortress to tie down Soviet divisions, it was clear that their position had become strategically meaningless. The failure of the Shyauliai counterstrike thus transformed the entire northern theater into a contained front, where German forces would remain isolated until May 1945. For the Soviets, the operational victory had far-reaching consequences. The Baltic states, which had been under German occupation for 3 years, were now open to reconquest. Soviet political officers and NKVD units followed the advancing armies, re-establishing control and eliminating local administrations that had collaborated with the Germans. The reoccupation brought immediate repression, arrests of anti-Soviet partisans, deportations of civilians accused of aiding the enemy, and mass conscription into the Red Army. In Lithuania and Latvia, many who had initially welcomed the Germans in 1941 now faced the return of Soviet authority. For local populations, the change of occupiers brought little relief, only a continuation of hardship under a different flag. In Berlin, the consequences of the failure were catastrophic for German strategic planning. The High Command had counted on the Panzer counteroffensive to stabilize the northern flank and free divisions for deployment against the Soviet Vistula Bug offensive in Poland. With the loss of Shyaulyai, that plan collapsed. The Wehrmacht now faced simultaneous crises in the north, center, and south of the Eastern Front. The destruction of several panzer divisions in Lithuania deprived Germany of its last reserve capable of launching a large-scale counterstrike. From this point onward, German strategy in the east would become purely defensive. The Red Army used the pause after the battle to rebuild its exhausted formations. The First Baltic Front reorganized its tank armies, replacing hundreds of lost vehicles with new T-34-85s and IS-2s arriving from factories in the Urals. Infantry divisions received fresh recruits drawn from recently liberated territories, while artillery units were reinforced with heavy guns from the reserve of the Supreme High Command. Soviet engineers repaired the main railway line from Vilnius through Šiauliai to Jelgava, ensuring a stable supply route for future operations. The First Baltic Front, despite suffering heavy losses, retained over 400,000 combat-effective troops after reinforcements arrived. Tank strength was replenished to around 800 vehicles, supported by more than 2,500 artillery pieces. Soviet engineers restored railway lines from Kaunas and Vilnius toward the north, converting them to Soviet gauge to ensure uninterrupted supply flow. Fuel depots, field hospitals, and repair workshops were established near Šiauliai, transforming the devastated battlefield into a strategic rear base for further operations. The efficiency of this reconstruction highlighted how Soviet war industry and logistics had matured by 1944, a stark contrast to the disarray of 1941. The Germans, by contrast, were no longer capable of strategic mobility. The divisions that had survived Šiauliai were merged into ad hoc formations. The once formidable Grossdeutschland division, for instance, was reduced to fewer than 4,000 men, supported by only a handful of tanks. It was withdrawn to East Prussia for reorganization, but never regained its previous strength. The 4th and 5th Panzer divisions were similarly decimated. Both were merged into a single composite formation, temporarily designated Panzerverband Söcken. Ammunition shortages were critical. By early September, reports from Army Group North indicated that daily artillery allocations had fallen to less than 10% of the required amount. Even small-caliber ammunition was rationed, and motor fuel was nearly exhausted. The German front in Latvia was thus static, relying on fortified positions rather than maneuver. Despite the exhaustion of both sides, fighting continued almost without interruption. Soviet reconnaissance units crossed into Latvia by the first week of September, probing German defenses along the Daugava River. Skirmishes erupted near Jelgava, Dobele, and Bauska as Soviet armored columns tested German resistance. The Luftwaffe attempted to impede the Soviet advance by bombing supply bridges and railheads, but Soviet fighter superiority rendered these efforts largely ineffective. With fewer than 150 operational aircraft available, the Luftwaffe could not prevent the Red Air Force from dominating the skies. Meanwhile, the human cost of the campaign was becoming increasingly apparent. Soviet reports noted that thousands of bodies still lay unburied across the Šiauliai battlefield weeks after the fighting ended. Medical units struggled to contain outbreaks of typhus and dysentery among soldiers and civilians. In many villages, local inhabitants were forced to clear minefields and dispose of corpses before they could resume farming. The scorched landscapes of northern Lithuania bore silent witness to the ferocity of the struggle. Burnt forests, cratered fields, and ruined towns stretched for miles. Soviet war correspondents described entire regions devoid of life, where even animals had fled or perished in artillery fire. For the civilian population, the transition from German to Soviet control brought both relief and new repression. Soviet authorities immediately reinstated collectivization policies, reintroducing state farms, kolkhozes, that had been dismantled under the German occupation. Former local officials who had cooperated with the German administration were arrested by the NKVD, often summarily executed or deported to Siberia. Anti-Soviet resistance began to take shape almost immediately. In the forests surrounding Šiauliai, small groups of armed partisans, later known as the Forest Brothers, organized attacks on Soviet patrols and supply convoys. The roots of this resistance would persist for years after the war, turning the Baltics into one of the most unstable regions of the post-war Soviet Union. In the military sphere, the aftermath of Shyaulyai revealed the shifting balance of power. The Red Army's success marked the near-complete destruction of Germany's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations on the Eastern Front. By September 1944, Soviet superiority in manpower, armor, and logistics was overwhelming. Across the front, the Wehrmacht could field barely 100 operational panzer divisions, many understrength and immobile. The Red Army, in contrast, had mobilized more than 6.5 million troops across multiple fronts. The outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. The only question that remained was how long the Germans could delay the inevitable collapse. Yet the Wehrmacht's resistance in the Baltics remained fierce. In late September, German rearguards launched localized counterattacks near Tukums and Dobele to secure evacuation routes for trapped units. These actions, though small in scale, demonstrated the discipline and cohesion that still characterized German field units despite their strategic hopelessness. Many German officers believed they were buying time for refugees to escape and for fortifications to be strengthened along the Baltic coast. The Red Army interpreted these actions as evidence that the enemy intended to defend the region to the last man, a perception that shaped Soviet planning for the upcoming Riga and Memel operations. By the end of September, the remnants of the German panzer divisions withdrew into Latvia and northern Courland. Shyaulyai, once the center of one of the fiercest tank battles of 1944, now stood as a rear area for Soviet logistics and administration. Military traffic replaced combat. Endless convoys of trucks, ammunition wagons, and repair units moved northward, preparing for the next stage of the campaign. Soviet military photographers documented the aftermath, producing images of twisted armor and shattered towns that would later appear in wartime newspapers as symbols of victory. The Battle of Šiauliai, viewed from the perspective of September 1944, had achieved its immediate military purpose, but also exposed the enormous cost of the Red Army's advance. Thousands of Soviet soldiers lay buried in foreign soil. Thousands more would fall before the Baltic coast was fully secured. The German forces, though shattered, had not ceased to resist. The stage was set for the next and final operations of the Baltic campaign, operations that would transform the isolated remnants of the Wehrmacht in Latvia into the Courland Pocket, where the war would linger for 8 more months before ending in surrender. By early October 1944, the Soviet advance that had begun with the Battle of Šiauliai had carried deep into Latvia. The victory in Lithuania had opened a direct route toward Riga, and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Baltic fronts now worked in coordination to complete the isolation of Army Group North. The destruction of the German counteroffensive at Šiauliai had left the Wehrmacht in the Baltics critically weakened, but not yet annihilated. Determined to maintain control of the Baltic ports and delay the Soviet approach to East Prussia, the German High Command ordered a final stand along the defensive lines of the Daugava River and around the Latvian capital. The Red Army, in turn, sought to finish what Šiauliai had begun, the total encirclement and destruction of German forces in the north. The Soviet offensive that followed was one of the most complex operations of the entire Eastern Front. Bagramyan's First Baltic Front advanced from the south through northern Lithuania and western Latvia, while the Second and Third Baltic Fronts pushed from the east. Together they commanded over 1 million men, supported by more than 2,000 tanks, 3,500 artillery pieces, and 1,000 aircraft. Their objective was to surround and trap the German 16th and 18th Armies, nearly 30 divisions, before they could retreat toward the Baltic coast. The Germans, numbering about 350,000 men with fewer than 400 operational tanks, fought behind hastily constructed defensive lines along the Daugava, exploiting forests, rivers, and marshes to offset their numerical inferiority. The remnants of the divisions that had fought at Šiauliai, Grossdeutschland, 4th Panzer, 5th Panzer, and several infantry formations were thrown into this new defensive struggle. Reduced to fractions of their former strength, they served as mobile fire brigades, rushing from sector to sector to repel Soviet breakthroughs. Their equipment was a mixture of what could be salvaged: a few remaining Panthers, Panzer Vs, and self-propelled guns mixed with captured Soviet T-34s. Ammunition shortages remained severe, and most units operated with minimal air support. Yet, despite these conditions, German resistance remained organized and tenacious. The terrain favored defense. Dense forests and narrow roads limited Soviet mobility and allowed smaller German units to delay entire Soviet corps for days at a time. On October 5, 1944, the Soviet First Baltic Front crossed into Latvia near Alesia and Dobeli. The advance was supported by massive artillery barrages that flattened German strongpoints. Soviet assault groups cleared the villages one by one, using tanks and flamethrowers to eliminate entrenched resistance. In several places, fighting took place at close range in the forests, where visibility dropped to a few dozen meters. Casualties on both sides were high. German infantry often fought to the last man, retreating only when encirclement became certain. The Red Army responded with overwhelming firepower, artillery barrages that consumed tens of thousands of shells daily, and aerial bombardments that left towns in ruins. As the Soviet spearheads advanced north, German command attempted a general withdrawal toward the port of Liepaja and the Courland Peninsula. The retreat was chaotic and conducted under constant pressure. Soviet mechanized units cut across the main roads, ambushing convoys and isolating rear guards. By October 10th, Soviet forces had reached the Gulf of Riga, severing the last land connection between Army Group North and the rest of the Wehrmacht. The encirclement was complete. Over 200,000 German soldiers were trapped in the Courland region. What began at Shyaulyai as a maneuver to reconnect the German northern armies had now ended with their complete isolation. The fighting around Riga became the final act of the Baltic campaign. Soviet forces launched their main assault on the city on October 12th. The defenders, approximately 30,000 men under General Otto Lasch, fought from fortified urban positions, supported by coastal artillery and remnants of the Kriegsmarine. The battle for Riga lasted 6 days. Soviet troops advanced street by street under heavy fire, often supported by tanks used as mobile artillery. By October 17th, organized German resistance in the city collapsed, and Soviet units raised the red flag over the ruins of the Latvian capital. The fall of Riga marked the end of Germany's 3-year occupation of the Baltic states and symbolized the completion of the strategic objectives that had been set during the Shyauliai campaign 2 months earlier. In Berlin, the news was met with alarm. The High Command declared the Courland Peninsula a fortress that must be held at all costs, arguing that its ports could still be used for submarine operations in the Baltic Sea. In reality, the region had no strategic value left. The trapped German forces were cut off from supply lines and surrounded on 3 sides by Soviet armies and on the 4th by the sea. Attempts to evacuate troops by ship were limited by Soviet air and naval dominance. Despite this, Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal to Germany or East Prussia, insisting that Courland continue to tie down Soviet divisions that might otherwise be transferred to Poland. For the Red Army, the success of the Shyauliai operation and the subsequent encirclement of the German northern armies represented a significant strategic triumph. The Soviet command had achieved the complete separation of the Wehrmacht's northern front from its central and southern forces. With the Baltic secured, the Soviet Navy regained access to key ports and naval bases along the coast, including Tallinn and Liepaja. The front now stretched from the Gulf of Finland to the Carpathians, marking one of the largest contiguous Soviet-controlled areas since the beginning of the war. However, the victory also came at a steep human cost. Soviet losses during the Baltic campaign from July to October 1944 exceeded 150,000 killed and over 500,000 wounded. German casualties were similarly heavy, with around 200,000 men lost in killed, wounded, or captured, and thousands more trapped in Courland. The physical devastation was immense. Cities such as Šiauliai, Jelgava, and Riga lay in ruins, and tens of thousands of civilians were displaced. The forests and farmlands of the Baltics, once prosperous, had become battlefields marked by wreckage and graves. By the end of October, the Red Army had fully secured the territory from Lithuania to northern Latvia. The success achieved at Shyaulyai had cascaded into one of the most decisive strategic encirclements of the entire war. Yet despite the Soviet triumph, the fighting in the Baltics was not over. The isolated German forces in Courland, though doomed, would continue to resist for months, fighting 6 more major battles before finally surrendering in May 1945. The shadow of Šiauliai thus extended far beyond its immediate battlefield, shaping the final months of war in northern Europe and defining the fate of the Baltic lands in the post-war order that followed. The months following the Soviet breakthrough at Shyaulyai and the fall of Riga were dominated by a grim and protracted struggle in the Courland Peninsula. What had begun as a desperate German withdrawal evolved into the last significant pocket of resistance on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht units trapped there, formally renamed Army Group Courland, numbered approximately 200,000 men, including remnants of 33 divisions. They were commanded by Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner, one of Hitler's most fanatically loyal officers, who was later replaced by General Karl Hilpert. Soviet units that had advanced from northern Lithuania were among the first to reach the Courland front, establishing a ring that stretched from Liepāja in the west to Tukums and Saldus in the east. The Soviet command viewed the elimination of the Courland Pocket as a matter of strategic security rather than necessity. With the rest of the Eastern Front moving west toward East Prussia and Poland, Stalin insisted on preventing any potential German evacuation or counterstrike from the region. The First and Second Baltic fronts, totaling more than 600,000 troops, surrounded the pocket. However, supply difficulties and the onset of autumn rains hindered operations. The terrain became a swamp of mud and destroyed infrastructure, reducing tank mobility and slowing artillery movement. In November 1944, the Red Army launched its second major assault on Courland, achieving limited success at the cost of heavy casualties, over 30,000 in 2 weeks of combat. Frostbite and disease spread through the trenches. Entire battalions lacked winter uniforms, relying on captured Soviet coats or civilian clothing. Ammunition was rationed to a few rounds per rifle per day. Yet discipline held. German officers emphasized that every week of resistance delayed the Soviet advance into northern Germany. Some believed that continued defense in Courland might provide leverage in eventual peace negotiations, a hope that had no basis in reality. The Red Army, too, suffered heavily. The 6 Courland offensives cost over 150,000 Soviet casualties, many of them incurred in repeated frontal assaults against fortified positions. Nevertheless, the Soviets maintained constant pressure to prevent the Germans from regrouping or organizing breakout attempts. By January 1945, when the main Soviet winter offensives were underway in Poland and East Prussia, the Courland front had become a secondary theater. It was maintained primarily to fix German forces in place, while the decisive operations unfolded elsewhere. The link between Shyauliai and Courland remained direct and symbolic. The German failure to hold Shyauliai had made the isolation of Army Group North inevitable. The pocket in Courland was its final consequence. The soldiers now defending the swamps and forests of western Latvia were the remnants of divisions shattered months earlier in the Lithuanian fields. Many veterans of the Shyauliai battle recognized the futility of their position. Diaries recovered after the war described their sense of abandonment, cut off from the rest of Germany, fighting in a war that had already been lost. As spring 1945 approached, German morale collapsed along with the Reich itself. Hitler's orders to hold Courland to the last bullet were obeyed mechanically, but without conviction. Soviet attacks in March and April met reduced resistance, as German commanders began negotiating local surrenders. The Baltic region, devastated by 3 years of occupation and warfare, faced the full reimposition of Soviet rule. The same summer, mass deportations began once again, this time targeting those accused of collaboration or resistance. The political and demographic consequences would last for generations. The Battle of Shyaulyai, though over by August 1944, had set in motion this chain of events: the destruction of Germany's northern armies, the isolation of Courland, and the permanent reabsorption of the Baltic states into the Soviet sphere. From a military perspective, the campaign illustrated the shift in the balance of power that characterized the war's final year. Germany could still fight skillfully at the tactical level, but had lost the ability to alter the strategic course of the conflict. The Soviet Union, having absorbed the costliest blows of the war, now wielded overwhelming strength in manpower, logistics, and industry. The Baltic victories, beginning with the breakthrough at Shyaulyai, completed the Red Army's domination of northeastern Europe and opened the path toward East Prussia, where the final battles for the heart of the Reich would soon unfold. The Battle of Šiauliai and its aftermath represented not merely a military confrontation, but a turning point in the struggle for the Baltic region and the entire northern flank of the Eastern Front. The summer of 1944 transformed the geography of the war. The Red Army's victory at Shyauliai severed the German land bridge to the north, led directly to the encirclement of Army Group North in Courland, and redefined the strategic balance in Eastern Europe. The operation's consequences rippled far beyond the destroyed fields of Lithuania, shaping both the outcome of World War II and the post-war order that followed. From a strategic standpoint, the Shyauliai operation demonstrated the Red Army's capacity for sustained, coordinated offensives after years of attrition. The Soviet command structure had matured into an effective instrument of modern warfare, combining massive firepower, mobility, and efficient logistics. The First Baltic Front's ability to regroup and launch successive assaults, even under heavy losses, revealed the depth of Soviet reserves and the industrial power sustaining them. Between late July and August 1944, the front advanced nearly 250 kilometers, destroyed or dispersed more than 20 German divisions, and captured thousands of vehicles and guns. The operation cut off the entire northern wing of the Wehrmacht and set the stage for subsequent offensives into Latvia and Estonia. For Germany, the defeat at Shyauliai marked the irreversible collapse of its strategic position in the east. The Wehrmacht's capacity to conduct large-scale counteroffensives was extinguished. The Panzer Counterstrike in Lithuania, the last of its kind on the Eastern Front, demonstrated that even elite formations such as Grossdeutschland and the 4th and 5th Panzer Divisions could no longer alter the outcome of the war. Shortages of fuel, ammunition, and trained manpower crippled every effort at recovery. The loss of the Baltic Corridor meant that the Reich's northern armies would remain isolated, consuming resources without contributing to the overall defense. The surrender of Army Group Courland in May 1945 was, in essence, the final echo of the defeat first sealed at Shyauliai. The human cost of the campaign was staggering. Soviet archival data estimate over 90,000 casualties within the First Baltic Front alone during the operation, including nearly 25,000 killed in action. German losses exceeded 110,000 men, with entire regiments wiped out or captured. Civilian suffering, though less documented, was severe. Yet, its strategic results were undeniable. The destruction of Germany's last operational reserve in the north, the isolation of hundreds of thousands of enemy troops, and the consolidation of Soviet dominance in the Baltic region. It demonstrated that by mid-1944, the Red Army was capable of conducting simultaneous large-scale offensives across multiple fronts, something the Wehrmacht could no longer counter. The remnants of the battle lingered long after the fighting ended. In Šiauliai itself, reconstruction began slowly. Soviet engineers cleared the ruins, rebuilt the rail junction, and reopened factories under state administration. War memorials were erected throughout Lithuania, commemorating the Red Army's liberation. Yet beneath the official narrative, the scars remained visible. Mass graves of soldiers from both sides dotted the countryside. Families searched for missing relatives, often without answers. Many local inhabitants saw no liberation, only a change of flags and the continuation of foreign rule. From the perspective of the soldiers who fought there, Šiauliai was a campaign of exhaustion rather than glory. German veterans remembered it as the moment they realized the war was lost. Soviet veterans recalled it as one of the most grueling operations of their advance to the West. Diaries, letters, and after-action reports reveal a shared sense of attrition, men fighting through endless forests and burning towns, unsure whether they were advancing or merely surviving. The battle epitomized the character of the Eastern Front in 1944, vast, mechanized, and merciless, consuming men and machines in equal measure. In the broader narrative of World War II, the Battle of Shyaulyai stands as the moment when the last German hope of stabilizing the Northern Front vanished.